The desert blacksmith thought he'd buried his past in the Afghan sands, along with the whispered tales of why the Taliban called him the Iron Ghost. Deep in the Arizona wilderness, Marcus Cole had found peace in shaping metal rather than destroying lives, until three ruthless ruffians discovered why some legends are better left undisturbed. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The merciless Arizona sun beat down on Marcus Cole's outdoor forge, where the steady rhythm of hammer-striking anvil echoed across the dusty valley. Sweat trickled down his weathered face as he worked, each strike precise and purposeful. The former Marine's weathered hands, scarred from both combat and craft, shaped the glowing metal with unwavering focus. His modest workshop, situated on the outskirts of the small town of Copper Springs, had become a sanctuary of honest work and hard-earned peace. Through the heat waves rising from his forge, Marcus watched the approach of Sheriff Elena Martinez's patrol vehicle, its white paint almost blinding in the morning light. The local law enforcement had become regular customers, appreciating both his skill with metal and his tendency to mind his own business. The sheriff stepped out, adjusting her hat against the glare, a broken pair of handcuffs dangling from her fingers. "Morning, Mr. Cole," she called out, her boots crunching on the gravel. "Got another pair that needs your magic touch." The hint of respect in her voice spoke of more than just appreciation for his craftsmanship. Marcus set his hammer down deliberately, wiping his calloused hands on his leather apron. "Sheriff," he nodded, his voice carrying the gravelly texture of desert wind. "Must be that new deputy of yours. Third pair this month." He managed a slight smile, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. If you're enjoying this story so far, make sure to subscribe to our channel. Tomorrow's tale will reveal why a legendary Marine chose to become a simple blacksmith in the Arizona desert. Elena watched as Marcus examined the handcuffs, his fingers moving with the same precision that had once made him legendary in another desert, half a world away. "Times are changing, Marcus, getting rougher. Copper Springs isn't the quiet town it used to be." Marcus grunted, already heating the broken links in his forge. The flames reflected in his eyes, momentarily awakening something dark and distant in their depths. "Town's still quiet enough for my taste." His right hand, marked with distinctive scars that spoke of violence rather than craftsmanship, worked the metal with practiced ease. Young Tommy Rivers, his 14-year-old apprentice, appeared from inside the workshop carrying fresh water. The boy had a keen eye for detail and an eagerness to learn that reminded Marcus of better days, before Kandahar, before the night that earned him both a Medal of Honor and nightmares that still woke him in cold sweats. "The Cortez brothers were asking about you in town," Elena mentioned casually, though her posture tensed slightly. "Word is, they're looking to expand their operation this side of the county line. Been throwing their weight around, intimidating local businesses." Marcus continued working, his hammer strikes never missing a beat. "Not interested in their kind of business." The words carried a weight that suggested familiarity with such matters. "They might not give you a choice," Elena pressed. 3 businesses burned down in Mesa County last month. Nobody willing to testify, of course. Tommy, listening intently while organizing tools, spoke up. "Mr. Cole, is it true you used to be in the Marines? My uncle was a Marine. He said—" "That's enough, Tommy." Marcus cut him off, not unkindly. "Past is past. These cuffs won't fix themselves." Before Sheriff Martinez could respond, a cloud of dust appeared on the horizon, accompanied by the rumble of approaching vehicles. 3 black SUVs, out of place in this humble desert town, were making their way toward the forge. "Looks like the choice just made itself," Elena muttered, her hand instinctively moving toward her service weapon. Marcus continued his work, but his movements shifted subtly. Years of combat experience had taught him to read approaching danger, and these vehicles carried the unmistakable air of threat. His hammer felt heavier in his hand, awakening muscle memories he'd spent years trying to forget. "Tommy," he said, quietly, "go inside. Work on those horseshoes we started this morning." The boy hesitated, sensing the tension in the air. "But Mr. Cole—" "Now, son." The tone brooked no argument, carrying an authority that seemed to transform the humble blacksmith into something else entirely. As Tommy disappeared into the workshop, Marcus set down his hammer and turned to face the approaching vehicles. His scarred hands relaxed but ready. Eleanor stayed where she was, one hand still near her weapon. "Marcus, I can call for backup." "Not yet," he replied, his voice carrying the calm of a man who had faced far worse than whatever was about to. "Step out of those SUVs. Let's see what kind of business the Cortez brothers have with a simple blacksmith." The desert wind picked up, carrying the scent of sage and heated metal across the yard. In that moment, as the black SUVs drew closer, Marcus Cole stood before, his forge like a sentinel, the flames casting dancing shadows across his face. The hammer on his workbench, its handle worn smooth by years of honest labor, waited patiently beside him, a tool of creation that had once, in another desert, been wielded for destruction. The approaching confrontation would soon reveal whether Marcus Cole could maintain the peace he'd built for himself, or if the man known as the Iron Ghost would need to resurface one last time. The three black SUVs pulled up in a V formation, kicking up clouds of red desert dust that swirled through the morning air. Marcus noticed how they positioned themselves. Tactical approach, blocking potential escape routes. Old instincts died hard. Sheriff Martinez remained by his side, her hand never straying far from her weapon as car doors opened in synchronized precision. Raul Cortez emerged from the lead vehicle, his expensive suit incongruous against the dusty backdrop of the desert forge. His younger brothers, Marco and Luis, flanked him, their pseudo-military posturing telling Marcus everything he needed to know. They were the kind of men who played at being soldiers without understanding the true weight of combat. "Quite the operation you've got here," Raul called out, adjusting his designer sunglasses as he surveyed the modest workshop. "Simple but quaint." His accent carried the artificial polish of someone trying to hide their origins. If you're finding this story intriguing, take a moment to subscribe. You won't want to miss what happens next in this tale of hidden strength and redemption. Marcus continued working the metal he'd been shaping, each strike of his hammer deliberate and controlled. "Something I can help you with?" His voice carried neither fear nor challenge, just the steady calm of a man who'd seen far worse than three wannabe gangsters in expensive suits. Marco, the youngest Cortez, spat in the dust. "Heard you're the only smithy for 50 miles, getting a reputation for quality work." His hand rested casually on the bulge of a concealed weapon, a gesture that might intimidate ordinary townspeople, but drew only quiet assessment from Marcus. "Fair prices for honest work," Marcus replied, setting down his hammer with precise care. Sheriff Martinez shifted slightly beside him, reading the tension in the air. Raul smiled, all white teeth and cold eyes. "About that. Copper Springs is growing, and growing businesses need protection, insurance, you might say, against accidents." He stepped closer, examining a finished horseshoe hanging on the workshop wall. "Would be a shame if something happened to this fine establishment." Inside the workshop, Tommy watched through a gap in the wooden slats, his young face tight with worry. Marcus had positioned him there deliberately, out of danger, but where he could run for help if needed. The boy's presence reminded him of another young face from his past, one that still haunted his dreams of Kandahar. "Already got insurance," Marcus said evenly, nodding toward the sheriff. "Town takes care of its own." Luis Cortez laughed, the sound sharp and ugly. Town can't be everywhere, but we can. Think of it as an investment in your future. 2,000 a month keeps accidents from happening. Sheriff Martinez stepped forward, her badge catching the morning sun. This sounds an awful lot like extortion, gentlemen. That's not how we do business in Copper Springs. With all due respect, Sheriff, Raoul's voice carried a subtle threat. This is a private business discussion. Perhaps you have other duties, requiring your attention. Marcus watched the interplay, noting how 4 more men had emerged from the SUVs, spreading out in a loose pattern he recognized from his military days. They were setting up firing positions, probably without even realizing it, amateurs playing a professional's game. Elena, Marcus said quietly, using the sheriff's first name for the first time in their long acquaintance, might be best if you check on Tommy's mother. Let her know he'll be late today. Sheriff Martinez caught his meaning. Get back up, but do it quietly. She hesitated only a moment before nodding. I'll do that, and I'll be back shortly to pick up those repaired cuffs, Mr. Cole. As she walked to her patrol car, Raoul moved closer to Marcus, lowering his voice. Smart man, sending the law away, makes our negotiations simpler. He produced a thick envelope. First month's insurance on us. Consider it a good faith gesture. Marcus looked at the envelope but made no move to take it. His eyes, when they met Raoul's, carried a depth that made the gang leader pause. Not interested. No? Raoul's smile faded. Perhaps you don't understand. 3 businesses in Mesa. County thought they weren't interested either. Very unfortunate what happened to them. I understand perfectly, Marcus replied, his voice carrying the weight of experience. You're used to dealing with shopkeepers and farmers, people who can be scared. He turned back to his forge, checking the heat of the metal waiting there. I'm not them. Marco stepped forward aggressively, hand moving toward his concealed weapon. You think you're tough, old man? You're just a broken-down vet playing with hammers. The words hung in the hot desert air, and for a moment something shifted in Marcus's demeanor. It was subtle, a slight change in his stance, a different quality to his stillness, the kind of change a cobra makes before it strikes. Last chance, Raoul said, his voice harder now. Take the offer, or we'll show you why businesses don't say no to the Cortez family. Marcus picked up his hammer again, testing its familiar weight. 20 years ago, in another desert, he'd learned that true strength wasn't in showing force, but in knowing when to use it. He'd also learned that some men only understood one language. You're right about one thing, he said, turning to face them fully. I am a vet, which means I know exactly what you and your men are doing, setting up a kill zone, establishing fields of fire. His voice remained calm, but carried an authority that made several of the Cortez men shift uncomfortably. It's decent tactical thinking if you're dealing with civilians, but right now you're surrounding my forge, my anvil, my tools. He gestured to the workshop around them. You've walked into my territory, boys, my terrain. The tension in the air thickened as Raoul processed the change in Marcus's demeanor, suddenly unsure if he was dealing with a simple blacksmith after all. The desert wind picked up, carrying the scent of hot metal and danger across the yard. You threatening us, old man? Louis snarled, but there was a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. Marcus turned back to his forge, his voice carrying clearly in the morning air. Not a threat. Just a fact. You've got 5 minutes to clear my property. After that, we'll see what breaks first, your courage or your bones. The words hung in the air like the desert heat, heavy with promise and menace. In the distance, a hawk screamed, and the confrontation at the desert forge balanced on a knife's edge between violence and wisdom. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. After the Cortez brothers retreated, their black SUVs disappearing into the desert haze, Sheriff Elena Martinez returned with her deputy, Jack Cooper. The young deputy's hand nervously drummed against his holster as he surveyed the scene. But Elena's attention was fixed solely on Marcus, who had already returned to his work, as if nothing had happened. "Got a call from Mesa County," Elena said, watching Marcus shape the glowing metal with methodical precision. 3 more businesses burned down last night. No witnesses, no evidence, just ashes and broken dreams. She paused, letting the implications hang in the air. "They're getting bolder, Marcus. If this story of courage and standing up to intimidation resonates with you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's episode will reveal just how far some men will go to protect what matters." Tommy emerged from the workshop, his young face etched with concern. "Mr. Cole, should I call my mom? Maybe I should head home early today." Marcus set down his hammer, wiping his hands on his leather apron. "No, son. Running from trouble only teaches you to fear it. Besides," he managed a slight smile, "we've got those new hinges for the church to finish." Deputy Cooper shifted uncomfortably. "Sir, with all due respect, maybe the boy should go home. The Cortez family. They've got a reputation. They don't take kindly to being refused." Marcus studied the young deputy, noting the fresh creases in his uniform and the way he carried his gun, like a burden rather than a tool. "Jack, how long you been wearing that badge?" 8 months, sir. And in those 8 months, how many times have you had to draw your weapon?" The deputy blinked, surprised by the question. "Twice, but I never had to fire it." Marcus nodded, turning back to his forge. "Good. A weapon drawn should be a last resort, not a first reaction. Same principle applies to whether we let threats rule our lives." He gestured to Tommy. "Hand me that curved file, son." As Tommy hurried to comply, Elena watched the interaction with growing understanding. Marcus wasn't just teaching the boy metalwork, he was teaching him about courage, about standing firm in the face of intimidation. Sarah Chen, the local schoolteacher, approached the forge carrying what appeared to be a broken brass bell. Her presence brought a different kind of tension to Marcus's shoulders, one that had nothing to do with threat assessment. "I hope I'm not interrupting," she said, her eyes taking in the gathered group. The school bell's clapper came loose again, 3rd time this month. Her gaze lingered on Marcus, noting the subtle signs of stress around his eyes that others might miss. "Never a bad time for you, Miss Chen," Marcus replied, his voice softening slightly. He took the bell from her hands, their fingers brushing, briefly. Sarah noticed the old scars on his knuckles, not the kind that came from metalwork, but from combat, from survival. "Those men who just left," she said carefully. "I saw them from the schoolhouse. They seemed dangerous." Marcus's eyes met hers for a moment. "Most men who try to look dangerous usually aren't, Miss Chen. It's the quiet ones you need to watch out for." He paused, examining the bell. "Always the quiet ones." Something in his voice made Sarah wonder just how quiet Marcus Cole really was and what storms lurked beneath that carefully maintained calm. She'd been teaching in Copper Springs for 3 years, and while the town knew him as a skilled craftsman, there were whispers about his past, about why a decorated Marine would choose to disappear into the desert with nothing but a forge and his memories. Elena pulled Marcus aside while Tommy showed Sarah his latest metalworking project. "Marcus, I've got 2 deputies. That's it. If the Cortez brothers come back in force—" "They will," Marcus interrupted, his voice low. "Men like that can't afford to look weak. They'll be back, probably tonight. Pride and fear make a dangerous combination." "Then let me call the state police. Get some backup out here." Marcus shook his head. By the time they arrive, it'll be over, one way or another. He looked at his forge, at the tools of his trade that had brought him peace after years of violence. Some things a man has to handle himself. Sarah overheard the exchange and approached them. My father was a Marine, she said quietly. He never talked about what happened in Vietnam, but he taught me that sometimes the strongest men are the ones who choose peace until peace is no longer an option. Marcus studied her for a moment, seeing understanding in her eyes rather than judgment. Your father sounds like a wise man. He was, Sarah replied softly. He also taught me that no one should face their battles alone. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the workshop as customers came and went. Marcus worked steadily, teaching Tommy the fundamentals of metalwork while keeping one eye on the horizon. Each person who visited seemed to sense the underlying tension, the feeling that something was building like a desert storm. Old Joe Running Bear, the Native American owner of the local diner, stopped by to pick up some repaired kitchen equipment. As Marcus handed him the fixed utensils, Joe gripped his arm. The desert speaks of trouble coming, my friend, the old man said in his gravelly voice. I can smell it on the wind, like rain and rust. Marcus nodded. Trouble's already here, Joe, just waiting on its timing. Then perhaps it is time for the warrior to remember his true nature, Joe replied cryptically. The hawk does not forget how to hunt just because it has chosen to perch. As the sun began to set, casting the desert in shades of blood and gold, Marcus checked his supplies one last time. Elena had reluctantly departed to patrol the town, knowing the Cortez brothers might try to strike elsewhere first. Sarah lingered, grading papers at her usual corner of the workbench, her presence both comforting and concerning to Marcus. You should head home, he told her, though his voice lacked conviction. It's getting late. Sarah looked up from her. Papers, her expression determined. Sometimes, Mr. Cole, the most important lessons happen after school hours. She returned to her grading, making it clear she had no intention of leaving. Tommy worked diligently nearby, his young face serious with concentration as he practiced the techniques Marcus had taught him. The boy's dedication reminded Marcus of another time, another place, where he'd trained young Marines to survive in hostile territories. The desert wind picked up, carrying the scent of sage and approaching darkness. In his forge, the flames danced like memories of firefights in distant lands, and Marcus Cole prepared himself for a night when his two worlds, the peace he'd built and the violence he'd left behind, would inevitably collide. As evening approached, the desert heat began to fade, replaced by a coolness that brought with it memories Marcus had long tried to suppress. He worked methodically at his forge, each strike of his hammer echoing across the yard, but his mind drifted to another time, another desert, where the sounds weren't so peaceful. If you're captivated by this tale of buried secrets and approaching danger, make sure to hit that subscribe button. Tomorrow's episode will reveal the full truth about the night that changed everything in Kandahar. Tommy, still determined to stay despite the growing tension, watched his mentor with curious eyes. Mr. Cole, he ventured, organizing tools with his practice care. How come you never talk about being a Marine? My uncle says the guys in his unit never stop telling stories. Marcus paused mid-strike, memories flickering behind his eyes like desert mirages. Sarah, still at her corner of the workbench, looked up from her papers, equally interested in his response. Some stories, boy, Marcus replied carefully, are better left in the past. Like metal in the forge, you heat it up too much, try to reshape it too many times, it becomes brittle, breaks. He resumed his work, but his rhythm had changed, becoming more deliberate, almost mechanical. Deputy Cooper returned, his young face tight with concern. Sir, I've been asking around town. Word is the Cortez brothers have a connection to someone, called the Butcher of Basra. Mean anything to you?" The hammer in Marcus's hand stilled completely. For a moment, the only sound was the crackling of the forge fire and the desert wind. When he spoke, his voice carried a weight that made everyone present sit up straighter. "Jack," he said quietly, "where did you hear that name?" One of their men was drinking at Riley's bar, talking big. Said their new partner made his reputation. In Iraq, then Afghanistan. Said he... The deputy swallowed hard. Said he collected scalps. Sarah watched as Marcus's scarred hands tightened on his hammer, knuckles white with tension. She saw something flash across his face, not fear but recognition, tinged with an old anger. "Mr. Cole!" Tommy's voice was small, uncertain. "What's wrong?" Marcus set down his hammer with careful precision. "Sarah, take Tommy home. Now." "Marcus," she started to protest, but he cut her off with a look that belonged more on a battlefield than in a desert forge. "The butcher isn't just a story," he said, his voice carrying the weight of personal experience. "He's the reason I—" He stopped, struggling with memories he'd kept buried for years. "He's the reason I left the Corps." Deputy Cooper shifted. Nervously, "You encountered him in Afghanistan?" Marcus moved to a locked chest in the corner of his workshop, one that Sarah had never seen him open. "Kandahar Province, 2005. Our unit was tracking a Taliban cell that had been targeting local schools, girls' schools specifically." His hands traced the chest's worn edges. "We thought we were the hunters. We were wrong." The desert wind picked up, carrying the smell of sage and creosote bush. In the distance, a coyote howled, the sound eerily similar to the calls Marcus remembered from those Afghan nights. "We lost 3 good men in the first ambush," he continued, his voice distant. "Professional job, military precision. That's when we realized we weren't dealing with ordinary Taliban fighters. The butcher was a former Spetsnaz operator gone mercenary. He'd sold his skills to the highest bidder, but money wasn't his primary motivation. He enjoyed the work, enjoyed the fear he created." Sarah moved closer, drawn by the raw pain in his voice. "What happened?" Marcus's right hand flexed unconsciously, and for the first time, Sarah noticed how some of his scars formed a distinct pattern, like someone had tried to flay the skin from his knuckles. "We tracked him to a village. He'd taken hostages, children from one of the schools, used them as bait." Marcus's eyes took on a haunted quality. "My team, we were good, very good, but he was ready for us. Had the whole place wired with IEDs, the villagers, the children. He didn't care who died as long as he got his target." Tommy, who hadn't left despite Marcus's order, listened with wide eyes. The boy had never heard his mentor speak so. Much about his past, had never seen this side of the quiet blacksmith who'd taught him to shape metal and respect honest work. "The official report says I was the only survivor," Marcus continued, his voice growing harder. "Says I eliminated the threat and saved 16 civilians. Says I earned a Navy Cross. What it doesn't say is how I did it. Doesn't mention that when your rifle jams, when your knife is lost, sometimes you have to use what's available." He looked at his hammer resting innocently on the anvil. "Sometimes the tools of creation become weapons of last resort." Deputy Cooper's face had gone pale. "You killed him, the butcher?" Marcus turned back to his forge, watching the flames dance. "That's what the report says. That's what everyone believed." He paused, his next words carrying a weight that filled the workshop. "But bodies have a way of disappearing in the desert. Both there and here." Sarah stood, her papers forgotten. "You think he survived? That he's working with the Cortez brothers?" "I think," Marcus said carefully, "that some ghosts don't stay buried, and some debts don't get settled with just one night of violence." He looked at the deputy. "Jack, get back to town. Tell Elena to keep everyone off the streets tonight. If I'm right about this, the Cortez brothers are just the prelude." As the deputy hurried to his car, Marcus finally opened the old chest. Inside, Sarah caught a glimpse of metal that had nothing to do with horseshoes or hinges, tools of war rather than creation, kept ready despite years of peace. "There's something else," Marcus added, his voice heavy with memory. "Something. Not in any report. That night in Kandahar, before everything went to hell, I made a promise to a dying friend. Said I'd make sure his sacrifice meant something. Said I'd never let another butcher hurt innocent people, not if I could stop it." The desert darkness was falling fast now, bringing with it the promise of violence. Marcus Cole stood in his workshop, caught between the peace he'd built and the warrior he'd tried to leave behind, knowing that before dawn he would have to reconcile both parts of himself. "Some promises," he said softly, watching the sun sink below the horizon, "don't have an expiration date." Night was falling over the desert workshop when Marcus heard the distinctive rumble of approaching vehicles. Not the Cortez brothers. SUVs this time. These engines had a different sound, military grade, bringing with them echoes of combat zones and midnight raids. If you're gripped by this tale of approaching danger and buried secrets, hit that subscribe button. Tomorrow's episode will reveal why some legends are better left undisturbed. "Sarah, Tommy, inside the workshop now." Marcus's voice carried the sharp edge of command, brooking no argument. "Stay away from the windows. Keep low." "But Mr. Cole," Tommy started to protest. "Now." The single word carried such authority that both Sarah and Tommy quickly complied, though Sarah cast a worried glance over her shoulder as she ushered the boy inside. 3 armored vehicles appeared through the desert haze, their matte black finish absorbing what little light remained. They moved with tactical precision, positioning themselves in a delta formation that Marcus recognized all too well. This wasn't local muscle flexing. This was a professional operation. The lead vehicle's door opened, and a figure emerged that made Marcus's blood run cold. Viktor Petrov, known in another desert as the Butcher of Basra, stood illuminated by the vehicle's headlights. He wore an expensive suit now instead of combat gear, but his predatory grace remained unchanged. The peculiar network of scars on the left side of his face, Marcus's handiwork from that night in Kandahar, caught the light like a topographic map of violence. "Marcus Cole," Petrov called out, his accent a cultured blend of Russian and British public school. "Or should I say, Staff Sergeant Cole, the Marine who wouldn't die." His smile didn't reach his eyes. "Did you think I wouldn't find you? That I'd forget what you did?" Marcus remained by his forge, one hand resting near his hammer. "Figured you'd show up eventually. Though working with local thugs seems beneath your usual standards, Victor." Petrov laughed, the sound carrying no warmth. "The Cortez brothers. Useful idiots, nothing more. They serve their purpose, creating chaos, drawing out my real target." He gestured to his scarred face. "You and I have unfinished business, Sergeant." Inside the workshop, Sarah pressed a hand to her mouth, watching through a crack in the wooden slats. Tommy huddled beside her, his young face pale but determined. "Those children you used as bait in Kandahar," Marcus said, his voice carrying across the yard. "They were innocent, just like the ones in the school behind my workshop." "Collateral damage," Petrov dismissed with a wave. "Necessary sacrifices in a larger game. Just like your team was. Tell me, do you still hear them screaming in your dreams? Staff Sergeant Michael Hayes, Lieutenant Sarah Rodriguez? They died badly, you know." Marcus's hand tightened on his hammer, but his voice remained steady. "You're still trying to bait your targets, Victor. Some things never change." More men emerged from the vehicles, professional operators, not local muscle. They moved with the coordinated precision of experienced combat veterans, taking up positions around the workshop. "You're right. Some things don't change," Petrov agreed, "like how a predator never forgets the prey that got away." Did you think becoming a simple blacksmith would erase what you are? What we both are? He spread his arms. We're hunters, Marcus. Killers. The only difference is I embrace my nature. You hide from yours. Marcus stepped away from his forge, positioning himself carefully. You've got it wrong, Victor. I didn't become a blacksmith to hide. I did it to remember. Remember what? That creation is harder than destruction. That building something means more than tearing it down. Marcus's eyes hardened, and that some men need to be stopped, no matter the cost. Petrov's smile widened, showing too many teeth. Ah, there he is, the killer I remember. He adjusted his cuffs, a gesture incongruous with the violence in his eyes. You know why I chose this location? Why I spent months manipulating the Cortez, brothers setting this up? Enlighten me, because here in this desert there are no rules, no witnesses, no collateral damage to worry about. Petrov glanced at the workshop. Well, almost none. I see you still try to protect the innocent, the teacher, the boy. Some habits die hard, yes? Marcus took a step forward, drawing attention away from the workshop. This is between you and me, Victor. Let them go. Oh, but that's where you're wrong, my friend. This is about making you feel everything I felt that night. The pain, the humiliation, the loss. Petrov's voice hardened. You took something from me in Kandahar, more than just flesh and reputation. You took my masterpiece, my perfect operation. Now I'm going to take everything from you piece by piece. The desert wind picked up, carrying the smell of creosote and approaching violence. In the distance, coyotes began to howl, as if sensing the impending bloodshed. Last chance, Victor, Marcus said quietly. Walk away, find another desert to haunt. Petrov's laugh was genuine this time, but no less chilling. You Americans, always offering chances for redemption. Even now, you think like a hero. He shook his head. There are no heroes here, Marcus, just monsters who admit what they are, and monsters who lie to themselves. The tension in the air crystallized, sharp as broken glass. Marcus could feel it in his bones, in the old scars that ached before violence, like others' joints ached before rain. You're right about one thing, Marcus replied, his voice carrying the weight of certainty. This desert is a good place to settle old debts. No rules, no backup, no witnesses. His eyes met Petrov's, just like Kandahar, and we both remember how that ended. The first shot would come soon. Marcus could feel it building like a thunderstorm. But this time, he was ready. This time he had more than just a hammer and desperate improvisation. He had a home worth defending, people worth protecting, and a peace he'd earned through years of honest work. The butcher of Basra had come looking for the warrior of Kandahar. Instead, he would face something far more dangerous. A man who had learned that the hardest steel is forged in the hottest fires, and that some legends survive because they carry truth at their core. If this story of sacrifice and redemption speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's episode will reveal the true cost of walking away from violence and the price of embracing it again. Inside the workshop, Sarah watched through the wooden slats as Marcus faced down the man from his past. Tommy huddled beside her, his young face a mixture of fear and fascination. The boy had never seen his mentor like this, stance balanced, presence commanding, every movement measured and precise. Tell me, Marcus, Petrov called out, his scarred face twisted in a mockery of a smile. Does the teacher know what kind of man she's been spending her afternoons with? Does the boy know what his gentle mentor did that night in Kandahar? Marcus's voice carried clearly in the desert night. They know what matters, that I chose a different path. Then let's tell them the full story, shall we? Petrov spread his arms theatrically. Tell them about the school, about the children we used as bait, Tell them how your team walked right into my trap, how the IEDs took out half your squad in the first blast." Sarah felt Tommy tense beside her. She placed a steadying hand on his shoulder, even as her own heart raced. "Tell them how Lieutenant Rodriguez died trying to reach the children," Petrov continued, his voice carrying a cruel satisfaction. "How Staff Sergeant Hayes bled out in your arms, making you promise something noble and ridiculous. Americans, always dying with speeches on their lips." Marcus's hand tightened on his hammer, but his voice remained steady. "Michael Hayes was worth 10 of you, Victor. He died protecting innocents. You murder them for profit." "Profit?" Petrov laughed harshly. "You still don't understand. It was never about money. It was about proving a point, that your rules, your morality, your codes of conduct, they're all lies we tell ourselves. In the end, we're all animals. You proved it that night." Inside the workshop, Sarah noticed something she hadn't before. A small trap door beneath an old rug, recently disturbed. She quietly moved Tommy toward it, understanding now why Marcus had insisted they come inside. "When the bombs went off," Petrov continued, pacing like a lecturer giving a lesson, "when your team was scattered, bleeding, dying, that's when the real operation began. You were the target all along, Marcus. The famous Staff Sergeant Cole, the Marine Corps' poster boy for counterinsurgency operations. Breaking you would send a message. But it didn't work out that way, did it?" Marcus's voice carried a dangerous edge now. "No," Petrov admitted, touching his scarred face. "Instead, you proved my point in a different way. When your weapons were gone, when your team was dead, when those children were screaming, that's when you showed your true nature." Marcus looked at his hands, scarred and calloused. "I did what I had to do." "You did what you were born to do!" Petrov's voice rose with savage glee. "They found 6 of my men beaten to death with a blacksmith's hammer. A hammer, Marcus! You turned a tool of creation into an instrument of such violence that even the Taliban whispered about it. They called you the Iron Ghost, the American, who came out of nowhere, who couldn't be killed, who used the tools of peaceful men to wreak unholy vengeance." Sarah gasped softly, understanding now why Marcus had chosen his new profession. Not to hide from his past, but to remind himself daily of both creation and destruction, of the thin line between the two. "The children survived," Marcus said quietly. "That's what mattered. The children survived," Petrov mocked. "But at what cost to your soul? I saw your eyes that night after you thought you'd killed me. I saw the recognition, the understanding. You knew then what I'd always known, that deep down, we're the same." "You're wrong." Marcus set his hammer down deliberately. "What I learned that night was that tools don't make the man. A hammer can build or destroy. A forge can create or consume. The choice is always ours." "Pretty words," Petrov sneered, "but we both know the truth. You didn't leave the Corps because of guilt or nobility. You left because you were afraid, not of death, but of how alive you felt dealing it out." In the workshop, Tommy looked up at Sarah with worried eyes. "Is it true, Miss Chen? Is Mr. Cole really like him?" Before Sarah could answer, Marcus's voice carried through the walls, steady and clear. "You're right about one thing, Victor. I did learn something about myself that night. I learned that every man has violence in him. The question isn't whether we're capable of it. It's what we choose to do with that capability." "And you chose to hide in the desert playing at peace," Petrov taunted. "No," Marcus corrected. "I chose to build something, to create instead of destroy, to show others that there's always a choice." He looked toward the workshop, seeming to meet Sarah's eyes through the wooden slats. "That's what you never understood. Strength isn't in how much you can destroy. It's in what you choose to protect. The desert wind carried the scent of sage and iron, and Sarah realized that Marcus's forge was still burning hot, tools laid out with precise care, not randomly, but with purpose. She understood then that while Marcus Cole had chosen peace, he had never stopped being prepared for war. "Enough philosophy," Petrov snapped. "I came here to finish what started in Kandahar, to prove once and for all that your way, your precious morality, your dedication to protecting the weak, it's all a lie. When this night is over, your students will see what you really are." Marcus's voice carried a weight of certainty that made even Petrov's men shift uneasily. "You're right, Victor, they will, and so will you." The desert night seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the violence to begin. But Sarah Chen, watching through the workshop walls, finally understood the true measure of the man she'd been growing to love. Not a killer hiding as a blacksmith, but a warrior who had chosen to become a creator, knowing all along that someday he might have to be both. The tension in the desert air was broken by the sudden sound of approaching vehicles, not military, but the familiar rumble of Sheriff Martinez's patrol car, accompanied by several others. Petrov's men shifted, weapons ready, but their commander raised a hand, seeming almost amused. "If you're invested in this tale of a community standing together against darkness, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's episode will show why some battles can't be fought alone." "Ah," Petrov smiled coldly, "the cavalry arrives. Tell me, Marcus, did you really think local law enforcement could make a difference here?" Marcus watched as Elena's patrol car stopped at a safe distance, joined by Deputy Cooper's vehicle and several trucks he recognized, belonging to Joe Running Bear, old Frank from the hardware store, and at least a dozen other townspeople. They were armed, but they were also civilians. This wasn't their fight. "Elena," Marcus called out, his voice carrying clear command, "stay back. This isn't your battle." Sheriff Martinez stepped out of her car, shotgun held ready but pointed down. "Wrong, Marcus. You made it our battle the day you chose to be part of this community." Joe Running Bear's weathered voice carried across the yard. "A man who fixes our tools, teaches our children, builds our futures. He's not just a neighbor. He's family." Petrov laughed, the sound sharp and ugly. How touching. The small-town Americans rally around their local hero. "Tell me, do they know what kind of monster they're really defending?" Frank from the hardware store spoke up, his old voice strong despite his years. "We know he spent 3 days straight repairing the church roof after the storm. Know he teaches kids like Tommy there's more honor in building than destroying. Know he's never turned away anyone who needed help, whether they could pay or not." Sarah, still watching from the workshop, felt tears in her eyes as more voices joined in. "He fixed my tractor when I couldn't afford a new one. Wouldn't take a dime." That was Bill Henderson, whose farm had nearly failed last year. "Taught my boy there's no shame in honest work." Maria Ramirez, whose son had been heading down a dangerous path before Marcus took him on as an apprentice, helped us rebuild after the floods. More voices, more stories, building like a wave of testimony. Petrov's amusement faded, replaced by something darker. "You see, Marcus, this is your weakness. You form attachments, create vulnerabilities, give your enemies hostages to fortune." He gestured to his men. "One phone call and the Cortez brothers. Burn this precious community to the ground, starting with the school." Marcus's voice cut through the night like a steel blade. "You're wrong again, Victor. These people aren't my weakness. They're my strength, something you've never understood." Inside the workshop, Tommy looked up at Sarah. "The school. My sister's in the 3rd grade. The Cortez brothers won't be burning anything," Sheriff Martinez announced. "State police picked them up an hour ago. Seems someone anonymously provided evidence of their entire operation. Bank accounts, smuggling, routes, everything." For the first time, Petrov's composure cracked slightly. Marcus allowed himself a small smile. "You're not the only one who can plan ahead, Victor. I've had 15 years to prepare for this night." You think this changes anything? Petrov snarled. My men are professional operators. Your little militia wouldn't last 5 minutes in a real firefight. Maybe not, Marcus agreed, but that's not why they're here. He looked around at the gathered townspeople, faces he'd known for years, people he'd helped, lives he'd touched. They're here to remind me what I'm fighting for, what I built here, what you can never understand. Sarah watched as Marcus moved with deliberate purpose, noting how each step brought him closer to tools she now realized had been positioned with tactical precision. The forge glowed hot behind him, casting his shadow long across the yard. In Kandahar, Marcus continued, his voice carrying to all present, I learned that violence, once unleashed, creates ripples, affects not just its targets, but everyone around them, changes communities, destroys futures. He paused, letting his words sink in. That's why I chose this life, not to hide from what I am, but to prove there's a better way. Pretty speeches, Petrov sneered, but in the end, it comes down to violence. Always has, always will. No, Marcus corrected. It comes down to choice. These people chose to stand with me, knowing the risk, just like I chose to stand with those children in Kandahar, just like I'm choosing now to give you one last chance to walk away. The desert wind picked up, carrying dust and the scent of creosote. In the distance, coyotes howled, a sound both mournful and threatening. The workshop's forge cast flickering shadows across the gathered faces, highlighting the resolve in their eyes. You talk of monsters, Marcus continued, of our true nature, but you never understood the most important lesson from that night in Kandahar. His voice hardened. A monster chooses to destroy. A man chooses to protect. Everything else is just justification. Sheriff Martinez's voice rang out clear in the night. Last chance, Petrov. Leave our town, leave our blacksmith alone, or find out what happens when you threaten a community that stands together. The tension stretched like heated metal on an anvil, ready to be shaped by the next strike. In that moment, Marcus Cole stood not as a hidden warrior or a simple blacksmith, but as something far more powerful, a man who had chosen his ground, chosen his people, and was prepared to defend both. The coming violence would reshape not just lives, but legacies. And as the desert night held its breath, waiting for the first move, Marcus knew that whatever happened next would prove, once and for all, that the strongest steel isn't forged in combat, but in the choice to stand for something greater than oneself. If you're drawn into this tale of a man torn between two worlds, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's episode will reveal the true cost of confronting one's past. The desert night grew colder as Marcus faced down his old adversary, each man representing a different path, a different understanding of strength. Behind him, his forge burned hot and steady, its flames reflecting off the tools he'd used for 15 years to build rather than destroy. Your townspeople's loyalty is touching, Petrov called out, his scarred face twisting into a smirk, but misplaced. They see what they want to see, the humble craftsman, the quiet mentor, the man of peace. His voice hardened. They don't. See the blood on your hands, the lives you've taken, the monster beneath the mask. Inside the workshop, Sarah watched Marcus's response carefully. She had spent countless afternoons in this space, grading papers while he worked, learning to read the subtle shifts in his demeanor. Now she saw something new emerging, not the gentle blacksmith she knew, nor the killer Petrov claimed, but something between the two. You're wrong, Victor, Marcus replied, his voice steady. They see exactly who I am. A man who chose to change. The real question is, what do you see when you look in the mirror? Petrov's laugh was sharp and bitter. I see truth, old friend, the same truth I tried to show you in Kandahar. That civilization is a thin veneer, that morality is a lie we tell children. When the bombs fell, when your team was dying, when those children were screaming, What morality guided your hands then? Marcus's fingers traced the worn handle of his hammer, feeling the grooves worn by years of honest work. I see you still don't understand. What happened that night wasn't about losing control. It was about choosing to do whatever was necessary to protect the innocent. Protect? Petrov spat the word. You beat men to death with a hammer, turned a simple tool into a weapon of such brutality that even hardened fighters had nightmares. You became death itself, a ghost in the darkness, dealing out violence with cold precision. Because you left me no choice, Marcus countered, his voice carrying the weight of old pain. You took away my weapons, killed my team, threatened children. You wanted to prove that deep down we're all killers, but you proved something else instead. Sheriff Martinez and the townspeople listened in tense silence as Marcus continued, his words carrying across the yard like hammer strikes on hot metal. You proved that a man's true nature isn't revealed by what he's capable of doing, but by why he does it. You killed for money, for pleasure, for some twisted philosophy. I fought to protect, to save, to give others a chance at peace. Tommy, huddled next to Sarah in the workshop, whispered, Is that why he became a blacksmith? Miss Chen, to remind himself? Sarah squeezed the boy's shoulder, understanding dawning in her eyes. To remind himself and to teach others. Every day he chooses to create rather than destroy. But he never forgot how to do either. Petrov's men shifted uneasily as their leader paced, his composure cracking slightly. Pretty words, Marcus, but we both know the truth. You ran from what you are, hid in this backwater pretending to be something you're not. The great Staff Sergeant Cole, playing at being a simple craftsman. I didn't run, Marcus corrected. I chose. Every day for 15 years I chose. Chose to build instead of break. Chose to teach instead of threaten. Chose to protect through creation rather than destruction. His eyes hardened. But make no mistake, Victor, I haven't forgotten how to do what needs to be done. The forge's flames cast dancing shadows across the yard as Marcus took a deliberate step forward. Sheriff Martinez noticed how his movement placed him closer to certain tools that, she realized now, had been arranged with tactical precision. You want to know why I became a blacksmith? Marcus asked, his voice carrying clear purpose. Because a forge teaches you the most important lesson of all, that the same fire that destroys can also create. The same force that breaks can also build. The choice isn't in our capabilities, but in how we use them. Sarah watched as Marcus's stance shifted subtly, remembering all the times she'd seen him work, how every movement had seemed measured, precise. She understood now that she hadn't just been watching a craftsman at work. She'd been watching a warrior maintaining his edge through different means. Your choice is simple, Victor, Marcus continued. Walk away. Leave this town, these people, this life I've built. Find your battles elsewhere. Or what? Petrov sneered. You'll show these good people what their beloved blacksmith really is? Let them see the killer beneath the craftsman? Marcus's response carried a weight that made even Petrov's hardened men tense. If you force my hand, I'll show them exactly who I am. A man who knows that the hardest steel is forged in the hottest fire, and that true strength isn't in the ability to take life, but in the choice to preserve it. The desert wind picked up, carrying the scent of sage and heated metal. In that moment, Marcus Cole stood balanced between his two worlds, the peace he'd built and the violence he'd left behind. But as he faced down his past in the form of Petrov's cold eyes, he realized that perhaps these worlds weren't as separate as he'd thought. Perhaps the true test wasn't in choosing between them, but in knowing when each was necessary, and in understanding that sometimes the best way to honor peace is to be willing to fight for it. If this tale of preparation and providence has captured your attention, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's episode will show why every tool has two purposes, and every choice has its price. Marcus moved with deliberate purpose around his workshop yard, each step placing him closer to carefully positioned tools. To most observers, it looked like the random arrangement of a working forge. To Petrov's trained eye, it was something else entirely, a battlefield prepared with surgical precision. "You always did have a gift for improvisation," Petrov noted, watching Marcus's movements with professional appreciation. "I remember how you turned that hammer into a weapon in Kandahar. How many of my men fell to it before you got to me?" "6," Marcus replied quietly, checking the heat of his forge. "Plus 2 more with a chisel. Would have been none if you'd just let those children go." Sheriff Martinez signaled her deputies to move the townspeople back, recognizing the calm before the storm. She'd seen enough bar fights and standoffs to know when violence was inevitable. Inside the workshop, Sarah noticed something she hadn't before: how the tools hanging on the walls formed natural handholds, how the workspace created clear lanes of movement, how even the position of the forge itself provided both light and shadow in tactical proportions. "Miss Chen," Tommy whispered, "look at the floor." The boy pointed to almost imperceptible marks scored into the wooden planks. Distance markers, she realized, for throwing weapons or judging spaces in the dark. 15 years, she murmured. He spent 15 years preparing for this moment, even while building a peaceful life. Marcus's voice carried through the workshop walls as he addressed Petrov's men. "Take a good look around you. Notice how the forge light hits your eyes, but leaves me in partial shadow. How the tools are arranged to create natural barriers and channels. How the ground slopes slightly toward the drainage ditch, affecting your footing." Several of Petrov's operators shifted uncomfortably, suddenly aware of their tactical disadvantage. Their commander noticed too, his scarred face tightening with anger. "You see," Petrov snarled, "this is who you really are, Marcus. A killer who thinks like a killer, who plans like a killer, who prepares for violence even while pretending to embrace peace." "Wrong again," Marcus replied, moving to his anvil. "I'm a protector who learned from experience. Every tool here serves two purposes: creation and defense. Every position has been considered, every angle calculated, not because I wanted violence to come, but because I knew someday it might." He picked up a length of heated metal, working it with practiced strokes. The rhythmic ringing of hammer on steel filled the desert night. "You know what the real difference is between us, Victor. You see tools and think of weapons. I see weapons and think of tools." Sheriff Martinez watched in fascination as Marcus shaped the metal, recognizing that even now, in the midst of brewing violence, he continued his craft. "What are you making, Marcus?" "Something I hoped I'd never need," he answered, quenching the worked metal in a nearby barrel. Steam hissed into the night air. "But like everything else here, it has its purpose." Petrov's laughter held an edge of madness. "Still the teacher, aren't you? Even now, trying to impart lessons. Tell me, what wisdom do you hope to share with your students when they watch you kill again?" "The same lesson this forge teaches every day," Marcus replied, examining his finished work. "That fire can destroy or purify. That pressure can break or strengthen, that the same force that shatters can also shape." He looked up, meeting Petrov's gaze. "The difference lies in the intent of the craftsman." Sarah watched as Marcus moved through his workshop yard with fluid grace, each movement bringing him closer to strategically placed tools. She understood now that every hammer, every rod, every implement had been positioned not just for convenience, but for this moment. "Your men are good, Victor," Marcus continued, his voice carrying clearly. "Professional, well-trained, but they're fighting on my ground, in my element. Look around, really look. Every shadow, every angle, every piece of equipment. This isn't just a workshop. It's a fortress designed by someone who spent 20 years in combat zones. The desert wind picked up, carrying the scent of hot metal and approaching violence. Tommy gripped Sarah's hand tightly as they watched through the workshop walls. "Even now, you're teaching," Petrov observed, a note of genuine curiosity in his voice. "Why?" "Because that's what I chose to be," Marcus answered simply. "A teacher, a builder, someone who passes on knowledge rather than dealing death. But make no mistake, I remember every lesson from our last encounter." He moved to his forge one last time, checking the heat. The flames cast his shadow long across the yard, a reminder of the two natures residing within him. The craftsman, and the warrior, the builder and the fighter, the man of peace preparing reluctantly for war. "Last chance, Victor," Marcus called out, his voice carrying the weight of certainty. "Walk away. Leave these people in peace. Find your vengeance elsewhere." The tension in the air crystallized, sharp as broken glass. Every person present felt it, the moment when words would give way to action, when philosophy would yield to physics, when the choice between creation and destruction would be made manifest in flesh and blood. In the workshop, Sarah suddenly understood the full meaning of Marcus's daily routine, how every strike of his hammer had been practice, every lesson to Tommy a preparation, every peaceful day a rehearsal for this moment when peace might need. To be defended with violence, the forge burned hot and steady, ready to serve whatever purpose its master required. And Marcus Cole, the blacksmith who had never stopped being a warrior, prepared to show why some legends survive, not because they're myths, but because they carry truth at their core. If you're riveted by this tale of skill and survival, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's episode will reveal why some legends are born in moments of desperate choice. The first shot came from one of Petrov's more nervous operators, a rookie mistake that Marcus had been counting on. The bullet sparked off his anvil exactly where he'd positioned it, sending hot fragments into the shooter's eyes. Before the man's cry of pain had finished echoing across the yard, Marcus was already moving. His movements had the fluid grace of long practice, each step placing him exactly where he needed to be. The heated metal rod he'd been working seconds earlier became a blazing arc through the darkness, catching another operator across the chest. Not lethal, but intensely painful, and more importantly, creating chaos in their carefully planned formation. "Hold your fire!" Petrov roared, recognizing too late the trap they'd walked into. The forge's strategic placement meant his men were silhouetted against its flames. While Marcus moved through shadows he'd spent 15 years learning to navigate. Sheriff Martinez and her deputies watched in stunned amazement as Marcus Cole, the quiet blacksmith they'd known for years, transformed before their eyes. Every tool in his workshop became a weapon in his hands, every shadow a path, every obstacle a tactical advantage. "Get back!" Marcus shouted to the townspeople as he ducked behind his anvil. "Elena, get them clear." Inside the workshop, Sarah pulled Tommy away from the wall as bullets sparked against the metal-reinforced exterior. Another modification she now understood had been years in the planning. "Your mentor," she whispered. To the wide-eyed boy, "He didn't just teach you metalworking, did he?" "No, ma'am," Tommy replied, watching through a crack as Marcus used a length of chain like a whip, disarming one of Petrov's men. "He taught us how to think, how to see things differently, how everything can have two purposes." The night air, filled with the sounds of combat, not the wild shooting of typical gunfights, but the controlled chaos of professional operators facing something they'd never trained for. Marcus moved like a ghost through his workshop yard, appearing and disappearing in the forge light, using tools and terrain with lethal efficiency. "The Iron Ghost!" Petrov laughed maniacally as another of his men went down, caught by a precisely thrown hammer. Now they see, now they understand what kind of man they invited into their community. A metal rod whistled through the darkness, striking Petrov's hand and sending his weapon spinning. Marcus's voice carried clearly. They see exactly what they need to see, a man protecting his home. 3 of Petrov's operators tried to rush the workshop, thinking to use Sarah and Tommy as leverage. Instead, they found themselves caught in a prepared trap, the ground beneath their feet suddenly shifting as hidden panels gave way, dropping them into the inspection pit Marcus used for larger projects. 8 years I spent installing those, Marcus called out, his voice steady despite the exertion. Every trap, every modification, every defensive measure, all while doing honest work, building honest things. Because men like you exist, Victor. Men who only understand the language of violence. Another operator went down, tangled in chains that seemed to spring from nowhere. Marcus had rigged his entire workshop like a complex machine, every piece serving both its legitimate purpose and a defensive one. You've lost half your men, Marcus continued, now somewhere in the shadows to Petrov's left. Not dead, I don't. Kill unless I have to. But they won't be fighting anymore tonight. Surrender. End this before it gets worse. Petrov's response was a burst of automatic fire that shattered several workshop windows. Sarah pulled Tommy closer, but noticed they were behind thick metal plates, cleverly disguised as normal walls. Even in making his workshop beautiful, Marcus had never forgotten its potential secondary purpose. You think this changes anything? Petrov screamed into the darkness. You think playing Batman with blacksmith tools makes you righteous? You're still a killer, Marcus. Still the man who beat my men to death with a hammer. The difference, Marcus's voice came from directly behind him, is in why we fight. The clash that followed happened too fast for most observers to follow. Petrov spun with enhanced veterans reflexes, but Marcus had spent 15 years practicing this exact scenario. The hammer in his hand moved with surgical precision, striking pressure points and weapon hands, disabling rather than killing. Petrov's remaining men found themselves caught in a carefully choreographed dance of steel and shadow. Marcus used his workshop like an extension of his own body, every tool in its place, every angle calculated, every move rehearsed countless times during years of peaceful work. You prepared for everything, Petrov gasped as Marcus's hammer swept his legs, sending him crashing to the ground. All these years. I prepared, Marcus corrected, standing over his fallen enemy, to protect what matters. The same reason I fought you in Kandahar. The same reason I'll always fight men like you. The desert night had gone quiet, except for the groans of Petrov's disabled men. Sheriff Martinez moved forward with handcuffs, her face a mixture of awe and understanding. The townspeople emerged from cover, seeing their blacksmith in a new light, not with fear, but with deeper respect. You could have killed them all, Elena said quietly as she cuffed Petrov. You had the skill, the preparation, the justification. Marcus looked at his hammer, the same one he'd used to teach Tommy the basics of metalwork just that morning. A tool does what its wielder chooses, Elena. Tonight, I chose to disable, not destroy, because that's the man I decided to be 15 years ago. The forge still burned bright in the background, its flames illuminating a workshop that had served as both creation space and battlefield. And Marcus Cole stood in its light, a man who had proven that the strongest steel isn't forged in combat alone, but in the choice of how to use one's skills in service of something greater than oneself. If this tale of redemption and community has touched your heart, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's episode will reveal how a town comes to terms with discovering their quiet blacksmith is more than he seems. The desert night slowly settled into an uneasy calm as state police vehicles began arriving, their red and blue lights painting the workshop in alternating colors. Marcus stood by his forge, methodically cleaning his tools and returning them to their proper places, while Sheriff Martinez coordinated with the arriving authorities. "Quite a setup you had here," Elena commented, watching him work. "All these years, every renovation, every improvement. It wasn't just about making the shop better, was it?" Marcus wiped down a hammer before hanging it carefully in its place. "Everything serves two purposes, Eleanor. A good craftsman is always prepared." He paused, studying the tool marks on the workshop walls, the bullet holes in the reinforced surfaces, though I hoped I'd never need the second purpose. Sarah emerged from the workshop with Tommy, the boy's eyes wide as he took in the aftermath of the conflict. The state police were leading away Petrov's men, some limping, others nursing disabled arms or shoulders, but all alive. It was a detail that didn't escape anyone's notice. If you're moved by this story of choices and consequences, hit that subscribe button. Every life teaches us something, if we're willing to learn. "You could have killed them," Tommy said quietly, looking up at his mentor. "But you didn't." Marcus set down his cleaning rag, regarding his young apprentice carefully. "Taking a life is easy, Tommy. Any fool with a weapon can do that. Choosing not to, even when you have the skill and justification, that's harder. That's what separates warriors from killers." Joe Running Bear approached, his weathered face thoughtful as he surveyed the workshop yard. "The hawk strikes to hunt, not for pleasure," he observed in his gravelly voice. "It kills only what it needs, no more." The other townspeople began gathering closer, their initial shock wearing off. They looked at their blacksmith differently, now, but not with fear, with a deeper understanding of the man who had chosen their community as his home. Petrov, handcuffed and seated in a police vehicle, called out through the open window, "They may accept you now, Marcus, but they've seen what you really are, what you're capable of. You can't bury that truth anymore." "You still don't understand," Marcus replied, his voice carrying clearly in the night air. "I never buried anything. Every day I worked this forge, I remembered Kandahar. Every tool I shaped, every skill I taught, every piece I created, it was all part of the same truth." He walked to his anvil, running his hand along its scarred surface. "A weapon can only destroy, but a tool can create or protect. The choice lies not in what you're capable of, but in how you use those capabilities." Sarah stepped forward, her voice steady. "The children you teach, Marcus, you weren't just showing them metal working, were you?" Marcus met her eyes, seeing understanding there rather than judgment. "I taught them that strength isn't about having power, but about choosing how to use it. That the same skills that can harm can also heal, build, protect." He looked at Tommy, "that every person has to decide what kind of mark they'll leave on the world." Deputy Cooper, helping the state police process the scene, shook his head in amazement. "All this time, we thought we were protecting you, but you were protecting us. Those renovations on the school last summer, the reinforced walls, the new security doors." "Like I said," Marcus nodded, "everything serves two purposes." Elena watched as her deputies began taking statements from witnesses. "The Cortez brothers are singing like canaries," she reported. "Turns out Petrov's organization had tentacles throughout the Southwest. Human trafficking, arms dealing, drug running, all hidden behind legitimate businesses." "Just like in Kandahar," Marcus said quietly, "using legitimate operations as cover for atrocities. Some patterns don't change." Sarah approached him slowly, taking in the organized chaos of the workshop, seeing now how every element had been carefully planned, every position considered, every angle calculated. "All these afternoons I spent here grading papers, watching you work. You were standing guard, weren't you, over all of us?" Marcus's face softened slightly. "A man protects what he values, Sarah. Sometimes with a gun, sometimes with a hammer, sometimes just by being present, being prepared. The state police captain, a gruff veteran named Rodriguez, approached with a thick folder. "Staff Sergeant Cole," he said formally, "that intelligence you gathered on the Cortez operation, it's going to take down their entire network, probably save hundreds of lives." 15 years of watching, waiting, documenting, Marcus nodded, ever since I tracked Petrov to their organization. Sometimes the best weapon is patience. Tommy looked around the workshop with new eyes, seeing beyond the simple tools and honest work to the layers of preparation and protection they represented. "Will you still teach me, Mr. Cole, even now that everyone knows?" "Especially now," Marcus replied firmly, "because you need to understand that every skill, every tool, every bit of knowledge carries responsibility. The choice of how to use it, that's what defines us." As the night deepened and the authorities continued their work, the townspeople gradually dispersed, many stopping to shake Marcus's hand or offer quiet words of gratitude. They had seen behind the veil of the quiet blacksmith and found not a hidden killer, but a protector who had chosen their community as his own. Lan Forge still burned, its flames a reminder that the same fire that had once forged weapons now created tools of peace, and Marcus Cole stood in its light, no longer straddling two worlds, but finally fully inhabiting both. The warrior who had chosen to create rather than destroy, but who remained ever vigilant in defense of what he had built. If this story of rising tension and determined protection speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's episode will show why some battles demand more than just physical strength. The peace following Petrov's capture proved short-lived. As the state police prepared to transport their prisoners, Deputy Cooper burst into the workshop, his young face pale with urgency. "Marcus, Sheriff, we've got incoming vehicles, lots of them, and reports of armed men approaching from the desert." Marcus was already moving, his practiced eyes scanning the horizon where dust clouds marked the approach of multiple vehicles. "Petrov's backup plan," he said grimly. "Should have known he'd have one. Elena, how long until those state police reinforcements arrive?" "Hour at least," the sheriff replied, already mobilizing her deputies. "And that's if they push it." If the tension in this story grips you, hit that subscribe button. The worst storms are the ones you don't see coming. Through the workshop windows, Sarah watched Marcus's demeanor shift. The quiet craftsman seemed to fade, replaced by something harder, more focused. She recognized it now, the warrior emerging not from hiding, but from careful restraint. "They're targeting multiple points," Marcus observed, studying the dust trails. "Trying to split our forces. Smart." He turned to the state police captain. "Rodriguez, how many men do you have?" 8, including me," the captain replied. "All armed, all trained, but we're not equipped for a small war." Marcus nodded, already moving to a locked cabinet in the corner of his workshop. "Victor," he called out to Petrov, still cuffed in the police car, "how many men in your backup plan?" Petrov's laugh carried across the yard. "Enough to level this miserable town. My employers don't like loose ends, and you've made yourself a very loose end, old friend." Tommy, helping Sarah gather their belongings, froze at these words. "Mr. Cole, what are they going to do?" Marcus's voice remained steady, calming. "What men like this always do, Tommy. Try to destroy what they can't control." He opened the cabinet, revealing a carefully organized collection of equipment that had nothing to do with blacksmithing. "But we're not going to let that happen." Sarah watched as he efficiently distributed equipment to the officers. Medical, kits, communication devices, even body armor, all carefully maintained and updated over the years. "You really did prepare for everything." "Not everything," Marcus replied grimly. "Just the worst possibilities." He turned to Elena. "They'll hit the school first. It's the softest target, and they know it'll draw our forces there." The Bank second, trying to split us further. My sister's at the school, Tommy said, his voice small but determined. And Mom works at the bank. Marcus placed a hand on the boy's shoulder. I know, son. That's why we're not going to let them take either. He looked at the gathered law enforcement officers. Captain Rodriguez, take 4 men and secure the school. Elena, you and your deputies cover the bank. I'll handle things here. Handle things? Sarah asked, noting how he was checking sightlines and positions around his workshop. You mean face their main force alone? Not alone, Joe Running Bear spoke up, his rifle held with the ease of long practice. Some of us old-timers remember how to fight. Other townspeople stepped forward. Veterans, hunters, ranch hands, men and women who had skills and were willing to use them to protect their community. Marcus looked at them with quiet pride. They're coming here first, he explained, directing people to positions he'd clearly planned years ago. This workshop isn't just my business. It's a fortress designed to be defended, every angle covered, every approach monitored, and more. Importantly, he added with grim satisfaction, it's a trap. Sarah watched as he quickly organized the volunteers, noting how each position supported the others, how every line of sight was considered, how even the workshop's architecture itself served a defensive purpose. When did you plan all this? She asked quietly. Every day for 15 years, he replied, checking his equipment. Every renovation, every improvement, every seemingly random addition, all part of a larger design. Because men like Petrov, they never stop. They just find new victims, new targets, unless someone stops them. The approaching vehicles were visible now, black SUVs and armored trucks moving with military precision. Marcus watched them through his workshop window, his expression focused but calm. Tommy, he said suddenly, remember what I taught you about the forge, about how metal needs both heat and pressure to become stronger. The boy nodded, clutching his teacher's largest hammer like a talisman. Yes, sir. Too much of either ruins it. It's about balance. That's right. And communities are the same way. Too much peace makes them soft. Too much violence breaks them. But the right balance, the right preparation. He looked at the gathered townspeople, now a mix of law enforcement and civilians, all united in purpose. That makes them stronger than anyone expects. Sarah moved to stand beside him, understanding finally blooming. That's why you chose this place, isn't it? Not just to hide, but to protect, to create something worth defending. To build something stronger than what I left behind, he agreed. In Kandahar, we were trying to protect communities that had been broken by decades of war. Here, I had the chance to help build one that could protect itself. The desert wind carried the sound of approaching engines, and with it the promise of violence. But as Marcus Cole prepared to defend his home once again, he saw not just the threat, but the fruit of 15 years of patient work. A community united, prepared, and unwilling to bow to fear. They think they're coming to destroy a town, he said quietly, checking his defenses one last time. Instead, they're going to learn why some places are worth protecting and why some men choose to be builders rather than destroyers. The storm was gathering, but this time Marcus Cole would face it not as a lone warrior, but as part of something stronger, a community that had learned his most important lesson, that true strength lies not in the ability to deal violence, but in the choice to stand together against it. If this tale of loyalty and preparation moves you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's episode will reveal why the strongest bonds are forged in the hottest fires. As the hostile forces approached through the desert night, Marcus took a moment to gather his defenders in the workshop. The forge still burned hot, its flames casting familiar shadows across faces that now wore unfamiliar expressions of determined resolve. Before this starts, he said, his voice carrying the weight of experience. I need you all to understand something. What's coming isn't just about me and Petrov. It's about something bigger, about whether communities like ours have the right to exist in peace. Sarah watched him as he spoke, seeing both the warrior and the craftsman in his stance, his movements. Even now, preparing for violence, his hands unconsciously organized his tools, kept his workspace in order. "Miss Chen," Tommy whispered, helping her stack sandbags near a window. "Look at how he placed everyone. It's just like how he arranges his tools, everything supporting everything else." She nodded, understanding dawning. Even in this, Marcus was teaching, showing them how individual pieces could work together to create something stronger than their parts. "Each of you has a skill," Marcus continued, moving among the defenders. "Joe, you've hunted these hills for 60 years. You know every shadow, every line of sight. Frank, your time in Vietnam taught you patience. Maria, your experience as a nurse might save lives tonight." He paused, making eye contact with each person. "This isn't about being soldiers. It's about being a community, about using what we know to protect what matters." Sheriff Martinez entered, her face grim. "Deputies are in position at the bank. Rodriguez has the school secured. But Marcus..." She hesitated. "These aren't just hired guns coming. Their equipment, their formation. These are professional operators." "I know," Marcus nodded. "That's why we're not going to fight them like soldiers. We're going to fight them like craftsmen, with precision, with purpose, with the tools we know best." Sarah approached him as the others moved to their positions. "You've been preparing them for this too, haven't you? All these years, all those little lessons and skills you shared." Marcus's face softened slightly. "Everything teaches something, Sarah. Every skill can serve multiple purposes. The patience needed to work metal, the precision required for delicate repairs, the understanding of how pieces work together. It all matters. Like how you taught Tommy's mother accounting," she realized, "but also how to spot irregularities that might indicate criminal activity." "Or how I helped Joe improve his hunting scope," Marcus added, "while teaching him to watch the desert approaches to town." The workshop had become a command center, each defender finding their place in the larger design. Marcus moved among them, adjusting positions, offering quiet advice, turning a group of townspeople into something more. Tommy suddenly spoke up, his young voice carrying clearly, "Mr. Cole, remember what you told me about the difference between breaking metal and shaping it?" Marcus paused, a slight smile touching his lips. "Tell them, son." "You said breaking is easy. Anyone can do it with enough force. But shaping, that takes skill, patience, understanding. You have to work with the metal, not against it." "That's right," Marcus nodded. "And the same is true for communities. Men like Petrov, they think strength comes from breaking things, from fear, from violence." He looked around at the gathered faces. "But real strength, that comes from building, from supporting each other, from choosing to stand together." Sarah watched as his words settled over the group, seeing determination replace fear in their eyes. These weren't soldiers, but they were something perhaps more valuable, people who understood what they were protecting and why it mattered. "They're almost here," Joe reported from his position. 5 minutes, maybe less. Marcus made one final check of their preparations. "Remember, this workshop isn't just a building. It's 15 years of preparation, of planning, of creating, something that can't be broken easily." He pointed to key positions. "Every tool has its purpose. Every position supports another. Every person here matters." He turned to Sarah, his eyes carrying a depth of emotion she hadn't seen before. "In Kandahar, I learned that the worst thing isn't dying for what you believe in. It's living without believing in anything." "And now," she asked softly, "now I believe in this. He gestured to the workshop, the town, the gathered defenders. "In what we've built here. In the choice to create rather than destroy, to protect rather than dominate." Tommy appeared at his side, holding out the hammer he'd been practicing with just that morning. "You'll need this, Mr. Cole." Marcus took the tool, feeling its familiar weight. "You know why I became a blacksmith, Tommy? Because every day at the forge reminds me that the same force that can destroy can also create, that the hottest fires can either consume or purify. The choice is always ours." The approaching vehicles were close now, their engines agrowl in the desert night. But in the workshop, surrounded by tools of creation and people of purpose, Marcus Cole stood ready to demonstrate one final lesson: that the strongest defense isn't in weapons or walls, but in the bonds between people who choose to stand together. "Whatever happens," he said quietly, "remember this moment. Remember that when people unite to protect what matters, they become something stronger than any force that tries to break them." The forge burned steady, ready to serve whatever purpose its master required. And around it, a community prepared to prove that some things, once properly forged, cannot be broken by any force of violence. If this moment of truth has captured your attention, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's episode will show why some legends are born in moments of desperate courage. The attack came from 3 directions at once, a coordinated assault that would have overwhelmed most defenses. But Marcus Cole's workshop wasn't most defenses, and 15 years of preparation were about to prove their worth. The first wave of attackers triggered the hidden pressure plates Marcus had installed years ago, disguised as ordinary paving stones. Powerful floodlights erupted from concealed positions, temporarily blinding the professional operators who'd expected to use the desert darkness to their advantage. "Now!" Marcus's command cut through the night air. Joe Running Bear's rifle cracked from his elevated position, picking off weapons rather than wielders, a skill honed through decades of precision hunting. Frank and his fellow veterans opened fire from reinforced positions, their shots carefully aimed to disable rather than kill. "They're not just mercs," Sarah observed from her position inside, where she coordinated the defenders' movements using the workshop's built-in communication system. "These are military-trained professionals, which means they'll adapt quickly." Marcus nodded, already moving. "Time for Phase 2. As if on cue, the attackers regrouped, shifting to covered positions, only to find that many of their chosen spots had been subtly prepared to be death traps of mobility. Years of landscaping and seemingly random construction had created a battlefield where every apparent advantage worked against them. "Like a chess game," Tommy whispered from his safety position, watching his mentor move through the workshop with fluid grace. "He set up the board years ago." The first attacker to reach the workshop's outer wall learned too late why Marcus had spent so much time reinforcing it. The shaped charges they'd brought to breach the building detonated harmlessly against surfaces designed to deflect and absorb explosions. 15 years, Marcus called out to the attackers, his voice carrying clearly. 15 years of planning, building, preparing. Every tool in its place, every angle covered, every approach considered. Ask yourselves, are you ready to die for someone else's vendetta? A burst of automatic fire answered him, sparking off the workshop's armored windows. Marcus moved like a shadow through his domain, each step placed with precision born of countless hours of practice. His hammer struck with surgical accuracy, disabling weapons and armor rather than flesh and bone. He's not trying to kill them, Sarah realized, watching through the reinforced observation points. Even now, he's choosing the harder path. The battle shifted as the attackers realized their usual tactics weren't working. They attempted to fall back to their vehicles, planning to use heavier weapons, only to find their tires shredded by cleverly concealed barriers Marcus had installed along the access roads. Your employer didn't tell you everything, did he? Marcus's voice carried over the chaos. Didn't mention that you'd be facing someone who spent 15 years turning a simple workshop into a fortress. Someone who learned in Kandahar that the best defense isn't in weapons, but in preparation. Inside the command center Sarah had established, Tommy monitored the security feeds Marcus had installed over the years. Miss Chen, look, they're splitting up, trying to find another way in. Just like he said they would, she nodded, remembering Marcus's earlier briefing. Which means... On cue, the workshop's external lighting shifted, creating disorienting patterns of shadow and illumination. The attackers found themselves channeled into prepared zones of control, where the defenders could efficiently disable them with minimal risk. Your choice, Marcus called out, as more attackers fell to precisely aimed, non-lethal shots and expertly placed traps. Surrender now, walk away alive, or keep coming, and learn why some places are harder to break than others. A familiar voice cut through the night. The commander of the attacking force, a man Marcus had encountered before. Cole, you think your little Home Alone tricks can stop professional operators? Not tricks, Colonel Richards, Marcus replied, naming the man he'd recognized by his tactics. Just the application of 15 years of patient preparation. Remember Damascus, the convoy ambush that went wrong? Same principles, different purpose. The attack faltered as defenders engaged from multiple prepared positions. Marcus moved through his workshop like a ghost, appearing where needed, his skills honed by years of precise work now turned to precise defense. He's not just fighting them, Joe Running Bear observed from his position. He's teaching them, showing them why their approach is wrong. Indeed, each engagement demonstrated not just Marcus's skill, but the futility of their attack. Every defensive measure revealed another layer of preparation. Every counter showed another aspect of the workshop's designed protection. Your men are down, Richards, Marcus called out as the last organized resistance crumbled. No fatalities, but plenty of injuries. Your vehicles are disabled, your communications jammed, your options gone. The only question is, how many more have to get hurt before you recognize the inevitable? Sarah watched through the workshop windows as the remaining attackers looked to their commander, uncertainty clear in their stances. They were professionals, trained to complete their missions at any cost, but they were also smart enough to recognize an unwinnable situation. Last chance, Marcus's voice carried the weight of certainty. Surrender now, or discover just how many more surprises 15 years of planning can produce. The desert night held its breath, waiting for the choice to be made. And in that moment, Marcus Cole stood in the light of his forge, not as a hidden warrior or a simple blacksmith, but as something more. A man who had proven that the strongest defense comes not from the ability to destroy, but from the patient work of building something worth protecting. If this tale of redemption and inner peace speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's episode will reveal how true strength comes from knowing when not to use it. As dawn broke over the desert workshop, casting long shadows across the aftermath of the night's conflict, Marcus Cole stood at his forge, methodically checking each of his tools. State police vehicles surrounded the property, processing the numerous detained attackers, all injured, but none fatally. Colonel Richards, now in custody, watched with a mixture of respect and bewilderment as Marcus returned each implement to its proper place. I don't understand, he finally said. You had kill shots on at least 30 occasions. Why go through the effort of disabling instead of eliminating? Marcus continued his work, his movements precise and purposeful. Because 15 years ago, I made a choice about what kind of man I wanted to be. Every day since then, I've renewed that choice. Sarah approached, carrying coffee for the defenders who had stood watch through the night. She paused beside Marcus, observing how his Hands, so capable of violence, now moved with gentle care over his craftsman's tools. "The workshop's barely damaged," she noted, surveying the aftermath. "All your preparations, all those defensive measures, they were designed to protect, not just repel." Marcus nodded, checking the heat of his forge. "A good craftsman maintains his tools. A good warrior maintains his skills. But a wise man maintains his principles." He looked at the gathered law enforcement officers, processing the scene. Every trap, every defensive position, all designed to capture rather than kill. Tommy emerged from the workshop's inner room, where he'd helped coordinate communications throughout the night. The boy's eyes were tired but bright with understanding. "Like you taught me about the forge, Mr. Cole, about how the same heat that can destroy metal can also make it stronger." "That's right," Marcus smiled slightly, ruffling the boy's hair. "And the same skills that can take life can also preserve it. The choice is always ours." Sheriff Martinez approached, holstering her weapon after a long night. "Just got word from the state police. With Richard's crew in custody and the evidence they're providing, we're looking at dismantling one of the largest criminal networks in the Southwest." "And Petrov?" Marcus asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. "Found dead in the transport vehicle," Elena confirmed. "Suicide capsule, apparently. He chose his own way out." Marcus was quiet for a moment, testing the edge of a tool that had served as both implement and weapon during the night. Some men can't let go of what they were, can't imagine being anything else but what violence made them. Sarah watched his face, seeing not triumph, but a kind of quiet sadness. "But you could. Had help," he replied, gesturing to the workshop around them. "This place, these tools, this community, they gave me something worth being more for." He paused, meeting her eyes. "Someone worth being more for." Joe Running Bear approached, his rifle slung over his shoulder. "The hawk that chooses not to strike is no less fierce," he observed in his gravelly voice. "It merely proves it's more than its talons." The morning sun climbed higher, illuminating the workshop where Marcus had spent 15 years building. Not just a business, but a philosophy of protection over destruction. The scars of battle were visible, but they didn't diminish the space's fundamental nature as a place of creation. "You'll have questions to answer," Eleanor noted, watching the state police document the workshop's elaborate defensive systems. "A lot of people will want to know about all this preparation." Marcus nodded, already beginning to heat his forge for the day's work. "And I'll answer them. But first, there's work to be done. Tommy's sister needs new hinges for her science project, and the Henderson Farms plow isn't going to fix itself." The boy brightened. "You're still going to teach me, even after everything?" "Especially after everything," Marcus replied firmly, "because now you understand the most important lesson, that every skill, every tool, every bit of knowledge carries a choice about how to use it." Sarah moved closer, her hand finding his. "And those choices define us more than our capabilities ever could." The workshop gradually returned to its normal rhythm as law enforcement finished their processing. The defenders who had stood together through the night began to disperse, returning to their daily lives. But something had changed. A deeper understanding had been forged in the heat of conflict. "You know what's remarkable?" Frank observed as he prepared to leave. "Not just that we won, but how we won. No deaths, minimal damage, maximum effect. Like a craftsman's project, rather, than a warrior's battle." Marcus smiled slightly, already focused on heating metal for his first project of the day. "Because that's exactly what it was, Frank. 15 years of craftsmanship applied to protection. The skills of a warrior turned to a builder's purpose. The forge burned hot and steady, ready for another day of honest work. And Marcus Cole stood before it, no longer torn between two natures, but finally whole. A man who had proven that the greatest strength lies not in the ability to destroy, but in the choice to create, to protect, to build something worthy of defense. "Time to get to work, Tommy," he called to his apprentice. "These tools won't maintain themselves." And in that simple statement, in the return to daily routine after extraordinary events, lay perhaps the greatest victory of all, the quiet triumph of a man who had chosen peace without surrendering strength, who had found a way to be both protector and creator, warrior and craftsman, all while remaining true to the principles he'd forged in the fires of experience. If this story of transformation and community has touched your heart, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's final episode will reveal how one man's choice can change countless lives. 1 month after the night that revealed the true nature of copper, Springs' blacksmith, the town had changed in subtle but significant ways. The workshop that had once been simply a place of craft had become something more, a symbol of resilience, a testament to preparation, and a reminder that strength comes in many forms. Marcus worked his forge as he always had, the rhythm of hammer on anvil, a constant melody in the desert air. But now his students included not just young apprentices learning metalwork, but townspeople eager to understand the deeper lessons he taught. "It's not just about shaping metal," he explained to a group that included both children and adults. "It's about understanding that everything we build, everything we create, needs to serve a purpose, sometimes more than one purpose." Sarah, who had taken to conducting her after-school tutoring sessions in the workshop, watched as he demonstrated. His hands, still bearing the scars of both combat and craft, moved with practiced precision over the metal. "The military's been calling," Sheriff Martinez mentioned, "stopping by for her daily check-in. Special forces, private security firms, all wanting to know about your defensive systems, your preparation methods." Marcus continued working, his focus unwavering. "Already turned them down. What we built here isn't about military applications. It's about protecting what matters, about building something worth defending." The workshop had become a gathering place for the community in a new way. Veterans found purpose in sharing their skills, teaching others not just about defense, but about the importance of creation over destruction. Local craftsmen contributed their own knowledge, showing how different trades could work together to strengthen the whole. "You've created something unique here," Sarah observed, watching as Tommy helped a younger student understand the basics of metalwork. "A place where people learn not just skills, but wisdom." Marcus nodded, carefully quenching a finished piece. "Because that's what we really defended that night, not just buildings or lives, but a way of thinking, a choice about how to use our capabilities." The town itself had transformed, though not in ways outsiders might notice. The defensive measures Marcus had quietly installed over the years were now openly acknowledged, maintained not just by him, but by the community as a whole. But they remained subtle, unobtrusive, protection that didn't compromise the town's peaceful nature. "The Henderson kids started a workshop club at school," Deputy Cooper reported, grinning. "They're learning basic crafts, but also about preparation, about responsibility, about choosing to build rather than break." Joe Running Bear, who had taken to spending afternoons at the forge sharing his own wisdom, nodded approvingly. The young ones understand now. They see that strength isn't just in the weapon, but in the hand that chooses not to use it. The forge burned steady as always, but now it served an even greater purpose. Each project that emerged from it carried not just the mark of craftsmanship, but the philosophy that had protected the town. The idea that creation and protection could be two sides of the same coin. "You're not just teaching them metalwork anymore," Sarah said softly, watching Marcus guide Tommy through a complex piece. You're teaching them how to build a community that can protect itself." Marcus paused in his work, considering her words. "Every skill has two edges," he replied. "What matters is teaching people to use them wisely, to understand that the same knowledge that can harm can also heal, can build, can protect." Indeed, the workshop's defensive modifications remained, but they had been integrated into its primary purpose as a place of learning and creation. The reinforced walls now displayed tools and finished works. The observation points doubled as ventilation. In for the forge, every element served both protection and production. The Cortez brothers' trial started today, Elena mentioned, examining a newly forged set of hinges, their whole networks falling apart. Turns out your patient gathering of evidence over the years was as thorough as everything else you did. 15 years of watching, documenting, preparing, Marcus nodded, because sometimes the best way to fight evil is to build the evidence that brings it down legally. Tommy, who had grown noticeably more confident since the night of the attack, approached with a completed project, a decorative iron gate for the school's new garden. "Built it strong, like you taught me, Mr. Cole. Beautiful, but solid enough to protect what's behind it." Marcus examined the work with careful attention, noting how the boy had incorporated both aesthetic elements and structural strength. "You understand now, don't you, why we build things the way we do?" "Yes, sir," Tommy nodded seriously. "Everything serves a purpose. Everything protects something, even if people don't see it at first." The desert sun cast long shadows through the workshop as another day of honest work drew to a close. But now the space held more than just tools and projects. It held a legacy of wisdom, a testament to the power of choosing creation over destruction, protection over aggression. "You've given this town more than just protection," Sarah said as they closed up for the day. "You've given us a future, a way to be strong without losing our humanity." Marcus looked around at the workshop where he had spent 15 years, building not just items of metal, but a philosophy of life. "Because that's what really needs defending," he replied softly. "Not just lives or property, but the choice to be more than what violence would make us." The forge's flames dimmed, but its warmth lingered, much like the impact of Marcus Cole's choices on the community he had chosen to protect and serve. In the end, he had built something far stronger than any fortress. He had built a legacy of wisdom, strength, and purpose that would endure long after the metal had cooled. If this story of transformation and purpose has moved you, make sure to subscribe. More tales of extraordinary strength in ordinary places are coming soon. 1 year after the night that changed Copper Springs forever, Marcus Cole stood at his forge, watching as Tommy demonstrated basic metalworking techniques to a group of eager students. The workshop had grown, expanding to accommodate both its traditional role and its new purpose as a center for community learning. "Remember," Tommy instructed, his young voice carrying the confidence of hard-won knowledge, "the same heat that can destroy metal can also make it stronger. It's all in how you use it, how you shape it, how you control it." Marcus smiled slightly, hearing his own lessons echoed in his apprentice's words. Sarah, now his wife, caught his eye from her usual corner, where she still graded papers while overseeing the workshop's growing educational program. "Some lessons," she said softly, "carry through generations." The workshop had evolved, but its core remained the same. The defensive measures were still maintained, now openly incorporated into the structure's design, but they served as reminders rather than secrets, testament to the importance of preparation and protection. Sheriff Martinez entered, accompanied by a group of law enforcement officials from neighboring counties. "Another delegation," she explained with a grin. "They're still trying to understand how one blacksmith shop became the model for community-based security across the Southwest." Marcus continued his work, shaping metal with the same precision that had once shaped the defense of his home. "They're looking at the wrong thing," he replied. "It's not about the defenses. It's about the community that makes them necessary and worthwhile." The visitors watched as townspeople came and went, each contributing to the workshop's dual purpose. Veterans shared their experience not as war stories, but as lessons in protection and responsibility. Craftsmen demonstrated their skills, showing how different trades could work together to build something stronger than its parts. "You've created more than just a security system," one official observed. "You've built a template for resilience." Marcus paused in his work, considering his words carefully. "What we built here isn't about security systems or defensive measures. It's about choices, about understanding that strength isn't just about the ability to fight, but about the wisdom to know when not to." Joe Running Bear, now a regular instructor in wilderness awareness and traditional crafts, nodded sagely. "The strongest tree bends with the wind, but its roots run deep." The workshop floor had been expanded, but Marcus's original forge remained the heart of the space. Around it, new forges had been added for students and apprentices, each one a potential center for both creation and protection. "Tell them about the medal, Mr. Cole," Tommy urged, proud of his mentor's recent recognition. Marcus shook his head modestly, but Sarah spoke up. "The Governor's Award for Community Service, for creating a new model of community defense through education and preparation rather than force." "The medal's not important," Marcus insisted, turning back to his forge. "What matters is what it represents, that there's a different way to protect what matters. That strength can be quiet, preparation can be subtle, and the best defense is often the one you never have to use." The afternoon sun cast familiar shadows through the workshop as students practiced their crafts. Each project that emerged from the forges carried dual purpose, practical items that could serve both peaceful and protective roles. "You've done more than teach us metalworking," Tommy said, helping a younger student adjust their technique. "You've shown us how to build something worth protecting and how to protect what we've built." Marcus watched as his original vision expanded and evolved, carried forward by those who understood its deeper meaning. The workshop had become more than just a place of business or training. It was a living example of his philosophy that true strength lies in creation rather than destruction. "Sometimes I wonder," Sarah mused, watching the activity around them, "what would have happened if Petrov had never found you? If that night had never forced you to reveal everything you'd built here?" Marcus considered this as he worked, the rhythm of his hammer strikes steady and sure. "The truth would have come out eventually, because what we built here isn't just about defense against external threats. It's about building something strong enough to survive any challenge, physical or otherwise." The day wound down, students and visitors gradually departing. But the forge kept burning as it had for 16 years now, a constant reminder of the transformative power of patient work and purposeful creation. "You know what I've learned, Mr. Cole?" Tommy asked as they cleaned up for the day. "That the strongest things aren't the ones that never get tested. They're the ones that get tested and prove themselves true." Marcus nodded, proud of how far his apprentice had come. "Like iron in the forge, Tommy. The testing makes it stronger if you know how to work with it instead of against it." As the desert sun set, casting the workshop in shades of gold and shadow, Marcus Cole stood by his forge one last time. The scars on his hands told two stories now, one of war and violence left behind, another of creation and protection chosen freely. "Some men," he said quietly to Sarah as they prepared to close for the day, "spend their whole lives learning how to destroy It took me half my life to learn how to build instead, but that's the real strength, not in having the power to break things, but in choosing to create something worth preserving. The forge's flames dimmed, but its warmth lingered, much like the impact of one man's choice to transform himself from a warrior into a builder, a destroyer into a protector. And in that transformation, he had forged something stronger than any weapon, a legacy of wisdom that would continue to shape lives long after the last hammer fell silent. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.